and you can go to just about anybody over the course of the last 25 years and ask them about unstructured information, and they will reply almost by rote that 80% of the information in an organization is unstructured and unmanaged.
All right, I'm joined by John Mancini. John is the president of his own consulting firm, Content Results, and the former president of AIIM, a well-known industry strategist, writer, and keynote speaker. Welcome, John. It's great to have you here today.
Hi, Jason. Nice to be here today. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, it's really my pleasure, and it's a rare opportunity to have somebody that has your depth of knowledge and experience in a number of other areas. We of course ourselves are limited by the number of customers that are happy to bring us in to interact with them, whereas yourself, you get to interact with pretty much everybody, and so your insight is going to be quite powerful here.
A lot of interesting insights into the good, the bad, and the ugly that's out there.
Oh, for sure. And as previously, we've talked a lot about the psychology too, about how bad and ugly rear their heads through sincere approaches that people have. So it'll be interesting to explore with you. In your own research and with AIIM, you'd done a number of different initiatives where you would ask CIOs and information officers and that type of thing about how much information do they perceive that they have. And there was certain percentages that they came back. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the nature of those studies, and maybe if they were a little biased in some way, or that's what the reality of what it is might be a little off from your initial findings of what people thought they had.
Sure. Yeah, the trigger for that was actually an interesting one, which is that we've had this article of faith in the industry for forever. I mean, in which, and you can go to just about anybody over the course of the last 25 years and ask them about unstructured information, and they will reply almost by rote that 80% of the information in an organization is unstructured and unmanaged. And that has a certain ring of truth to it. And so a few years ago, I thought, well, I wonder what the source is of this. And so I started to try and find what the source was. And the source is a Coopers and Lybrand study that no one can produce. I even posted a bounty if somebody could produce it. So I decided that I would start asking this question myself to sort of see if that 80% had any legs to it and what it was all about. So I started asking people two questions, and I've asked these questions of about 1,000 people. So first question is, if the volume of information you're managing now is X, what do you think it's going to be in 2 to 3 years? And the answer almost universally comes back somewhere between 4 and 4.5x. So that's the volume side of the equation. In other words, it's growing incredibly dramatically, and people realize that it's growing dramatically. The other side of the equation is, what is this stuff? And so the second question I ask is, when you think about that information, what percentage of it is either unstructured or semi-structured, basically the stuff that all of us in the content business call content? What percent is that, and what percent is hard data? And that answer almost comes back universally consistent, which is not quite the 80%, but 60%. And so you put those two things together, and you have a recipe on the volume side and on the variety side for a very rich stew of complexity that organizations are not very well equipped to deal with. And the old ways of dealing with that are proving that they just don't work anymore.
There's a perception out there that unstructured data is a particular platonic thing, and that structured data is this other platonic thing. To me, I think it's various levels of gray. What impact would you say the lack of standardization in our language to have this conversation might have made it difficult for industry and people tasked with implementing these programs in order to actually try to have success? This might hold them back.
Oh, it's an enormous problem for organizations. And it's really funny, you know, if you talk to people on the data side of the house and you start talking about unstructured information, they have a completely different perception about what that is than when you ask content people who think that content is what unstructured information is all about. And so for the most part, most user organizations don't care. They just know they have a lot of stuff that needs to be managed.
Well, for sure. And when I think about the classic use case for records management is when you're brought into the litigation and counsel during discovery, or right in front of the judge when they ask, was this content or document or file or media managed in accordance with policy, disposed in accordance with policy? All of a sudden, it doesn't matter what your definition is. It only matters whether or not you are able to show the appropriate life cycle associated with whether you call it data, content, or anything else.
Yeah, I mean, and there are differences in how you manage information, how you manage, say, a chat stream that you have versus, say, preservation of a contract or an insurance policy or something like that for the life of a policyholder or the life of a contract. And there are differences in how you go about that. But the reality is that they're all different forms of information. Some of that is records. Some of them are not records. It's just information that needs to be managed. Retention management is different than records management. And most organizations have, you know, a tiny percentage of their information that is records in the traditional sense of thinking about the word. But it all needs to be managed, and it all needs to be managed depending on what it is, on the life cycle requirements of that information, the business requirements, and the records and legal requirements. But they're different stakeholders in the equation.
Yeah, and it's going back to something you alluded to at the end of your very first point when we were talking about the vendors who haven't been able to capture this data at scale. I think it's that quite often they kind of hide in these corners of, okay, I'm going to hide in this corner of these well-structured records, or I'm going to hide in this corner, a big corner of collaboration. And that, like when you think of SharePoint and OneDrive and all that, we'd never want to get rid of it. However, it has yet to prove itself as being the end-to-end solution for a big enterprise for records management and collaboration and content management. So how do you think we got here? And was it just because nobody anticipated, and well, you go back to 1988 when some of the leading vendors first created their software, did nobody really anticipate this hockey stick effect of this content?
Well, I think a lot of this goes back to the fact of what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and what is the fit of the tool to solve that particular problem. So when you go back to the late 80s and early 90s, when content management, ECM as we call it, you know, kind of got its rooting in the marketplace, what it was about was taking mission critical, document intensive, large scale processes at large organizations, and how do you figure out how to automate those processes? Okay, so that's what content management, if you will, was all about. Very close tie to process management, and very close tie to the limited amounts of information that were tied to that particular business process. And that's a different problem altogether than looking at information writ large across an organization. It's just a subset of that problem. And so the challenge, I think, that many end user organizations have is because of the way that ECM grew up, and it grew up in that process specific, departmentally specific kind of mindset, scaling that to the enterprise writ large is not necessarily an easy thing, nor necessarily at times even an appropriate thing, because those tools are really good, they're robust, they're wired into organizations, they're hard to displace, but they're not designed for every use case. And so that's, I think, the challenge that organizations have now, because the hockey stick part of that growth is taking off. And it gets more and more complex as organizations move from very self-defined and self-contained processes to thinking more in terms of customer journeys that cut across different processes, that's a whole different kettle of fish, I think, for organizations. And so it's not that ECM is bad. It's not that these solutions are inappropriate, but solutions need to fit the task that they're trying to deal with.
Yeah, for sure. And there's an old adage of when things aren't working well, and when I say aren't working well, like, I mean, all the vendors are doing fine. They're just not capturing the scale of information that we're doing. But what people try to do is more of what they've always done, or they stop doing what they're doing and they forget to sidestep and let's see what's new that could be done. Is that happening in this industry?
Yeah,
And
I mean,
why
yeah.
do you think that happens?
Well, and I think there's still a mindset in many places of trying to take paper-based disciplines and paradigms and apply them to this new world of exponential data creation that we're moving into. And so the challenge there is it's just not going to work because the scale is too large. So, you think about something like disposition management, for example, and many organizations have these very elaborate retention policies, and they'll first of all, a lot of them are event-based disposition policies and retention policies, which are just a disaster from an automation perspective when you try to deal with that, because the target varies depending on the event kind of moving forward. But it's, when you think about how do you do that at scale, one of the challenges is that many organizations, they will have a retention policy and a retention date in there, and then they'll have a manual disposition process at the end of that. So, I was talking to a friend of mine, a fellow named Atlas Sheckland from a company called Infotection about this. And Atlas told me, he says, think about it this way. Suppose you have a manual disposition and it takes 15 minutes for some person to look at something and decide whether to get rid of it or not. So that means they can do 4 disposition reviews per hour. That means they can do 32 disposition reviews per day. So let's imagine you have 1 million records that have disposition associated with them, and manual disposition associated with them. You do the math, and that comes back to 31,250 person days to do that disposition. That's 104 person years of effort. And that's only for 1 million records. So my point there is that when you think about the process in the old way, which was paper-based, and you think about what was natural in the paper world, which was like, let me take this thing, decide whether I want to keep it. Okay, if we're going to keep it, we're going to put it over here. At scale, that breaks down. And that's a recipe to do nothing.
There's not a feeling of exploration. There's a feeling that we should be exploiting the rules that are in place and the tools that are in place. It's exploit, 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 and not enough time really truly exploring what the options are, what the alternatives are, and what the efficacy of what they're trying to do really should be.
Well, and I think some of that also has to do with the lag time that exists particularly in organizations at scale, as they think about how do they modify and how do they enhance their legacy systems to sort of meet the next element of challenge. And so what you find is that, the technology providers are out here someplace and saying, we can do X. And the users in many cases are back here saying, I only just digested what you were talking about here, never mind what you're talking about here. And so, a lot of vendors have an existing bias to preserve that customer base. And so, this is a time when organizations need to take a little bit of a step back. They need to understand the role that their legacy systems play. They need to think about the data associated with all of those applications. They need to free their thinking from thinking that that data has to necessarily be tied to the application. Think of it more agnostically, and then view it from the perspective of, okay, what are the new tools that exist out there to try to manage this at scale and at less risk than we historically have had. It's a big challenge. Don't get me wrong, but it's I think the challenge that organizations have right now.
I completely agree. Like working backwards, having a look at the customers that we have, for some reason they didn't realize that their first job was to understand the scope of their problem, understand what they had before they made that application decision.
Yeah.
They moved straight to the finish line of, okay, this is how we're going to manage the data. But they forgot that they had to move the ball all the way from the 1 yard line all the way to the end zone by navigating through and figuring out what the landscape looks like. They just skip to the end and then wonder why, how come there's no data in the system?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Because if you wind up, say you have a new drug application process in a pharmaceutical company that you are, every day, every hour counts in terms of your ability to reap profits off of that invention. So every moment that the approval process is delayed costs you money, costs you significant money. Sometimes relates to whether the drug itself is even feasible to develop. And so you get very microscopically focused on making sure that process moves as effectively and as efficiently as it possibly can. And that was like one of the rich grounds associated with content management in its early stages. But that's a different kind of process than tens or even hundreds of thousands of knowledge workers interacting with systems on a day-to-day basis, creating information all over the place. And how do you manage that at scale? Think about it in terms of what we've gone through with COVID now, and think about it in terms of if you think about Teams, for example. I don't know what the latest data was, but back in November of 2019, I think Microsoft said that there were about 20 million average daily users of Teams. By the same time, about a year after that, it had gone to about 200 million. You can't tell me that a lot of those people really thought through all the records and governance and retention management issues associated with that growth. They had to get something done. They had to connect up workers. And lo and behold, it's amazing to me. You talk to a lot of people and say, well, you realize you're creating OneDrive records when you have a document there, and you realize that you're creating SharePoint information. And the emergency nature that we were in trying to get these systems up and operating, I think now people are coming back and thinking, okay, what do we do about that? How do we deal with it? How do we address it?
Yeah, that's really interesting that you bring up Teams too, because that's a funny handy hammer syndrome that I think a lot of people had, because they see a lot of people generating a lot of content. And we've had people ask us, well, should Teams be the spot where we do our records management now? And to me, it seemed it wasn't a great question, because it's just yet another spot again. And it didn't ask the first question is, what's the nature of the content that's in there, and what does it need with respect to information governance and management?
Yeah, what is that content? What is it all about? And Teams is an interesting example because in the content space, we've been talking for a long time about the desire to push employees into resisting using very atomistic kinds of solutions out there, where they do chat over here, they do video over here, they do documents over here, they do saving videos over here. And Teams does provide a unified platform to do that. But how that will all shake out, I think, is one of the big questions out there right now, and how organizations can leverage an enhanced set of information management capabilities that exist within the M365 suite that they never had before. But conceptualizing those capabilities and utilizing those capabilities are two separate things.
And it really lends itself to going back to your individual manually going through different systems to pick up a document and analyze it. It's yet another place that you would have to train somebody to go and find it and have the proprietary knowledge to make decisions based upon different multimedia and inference based upon work in progress data. It is a very difficult problem if you look at it through that manual lens.
Yeah, then and that's a good point that, when you talked about earlier the cultural shift that needs to go on in organizations in terms of how they think about all of this. We've had a fairly unrealistic set of expectations about whether knowledge workers would actually care and help us in the job of records management. And that, I think, goes back again to the idea that how outdated paper-based paradigms are to thinking about that problem. Because when you're in a paper world and you were working on a contract, or you're working on you collect all the work papers, you staple them together, you stick them in a file, and that's kind of all said and done. And that's a much easier thing to ask a knowledge worker to do than to somehow manually apply that process to a digital age. And so that's, I think, one of the assumptions that needs to change, is that we need to stop thinking that individual knowledge workers, knowledge managers are going to be willing to perform the information retention and management function for us. They're just not, they don't have time, they don't have interest. You can train them in certain elements of information security that are important to an organization, but expecting those folks to manually do tasks that should be automated, it's not going to happen.
And thank you for reminding people of that as well, because that was an early mantra of the records managers was, we're going to tell people, because it's the company rule, that they have to do this and they must comply because it's the rule, and without teeth.
Yeah, even now, just look at all the ways that different people manage email. I mean, you can go into any organization, no matter what central IT has told them about that. You'll have people that have these huge, gigantic archives in their email. You'll have other people that have taken that information and moved it off someplace else. It's a very difficult thing to rely on busy knowledge workers who are being stretched thinner and thinner and thinner in terms of the number of jobs that they're trying to do, to also get them to think about how they do records and information management. Has to occur in the background, has to occur with labels that automatically categorize things without them even having to do anything.
Yeah, certainly the volume of information coming at us and coming out of us is dramatic. And we do exploit automation without even realizing it. Every inbox filter that we put in place and every mechanism that automatically sorts for us is really at a micro scale what we need at the macro scale.
Yeah, and people come to the job with the expectations that they have from the consumer side of their lives, and they expect a lot of those systems to work as seamlessly and easily and in the background as those consumer systems do. And the reality in many organizations that we've had unrealistic expectations of what we expect knowledge workers to do to help us in this task.
I know that it's unrealistic to have people expect consumer level, but is there a maturity that needs to happen from enterprise customers that they set a standard and be willing to actually invest in the standard to make sure that the software is up to the snuff that these new employees might expect?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that all of this is a way more complicated task than people think it is, and particularly at scale, and particularly for global organizations that operate with myriad number of regulatory and legal environments that they're trying to operate. And so, I was talking to a company recently, a Fortune company. They were tasked basically with standardizing a lot of the approach that they have to information retention. And this was being driven by the audit function within their company. Well, when they started peeling away the covers, the company had hundreds of different applications out there, each of which carried information along with them, that was expected to be managed. They had petabytes of file shares floating around out there, had totally unmanaged M365 implementations across tens of thousands of employees. And so again, when you start peeling away the onion, that's a really complicated task for organizations to try to put some swim lanes around that that problem. And it's not going to be solved with just a snap of the fingers, and it's not going to be solved most likely by expecting each individual application to somehow manage that information intelligently and from a risk-based perspective. So my point there is just, organizations don't have the luxury. I always say this in many systems environments. They don't have the luxury of turning the juice off and then rewiring the house. They have to lots of times rewire the house while the juice is still on. And that requires a really different way of thinking about the problem.